You're standing at the edge of something ancient. Not ancient the way your grandmother's house feels ancient, with its peeling wallpaper and photographs of people whose names no one remembers anymore. Not ancient the way a Civil War battlefield feels ancient, where you can almost hear the cannons if you close your eyes and let the silence work on you long enough. Not even ancient the way the Egyptian pyramids feel ancient, those towering geometric impossibilities rising from desert sand that has seen 40 centuries of human ambition come and go. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient in a way that makes all of those things feel like they happened 5 minutes ago. They were here before the Atlantic Ocean existed, before the dinosaurs walked the earth, before complex animal life had figured out how to drag itself onto dry land and breathe open air for the first time. When these mountains were young, the planet itself was still working out the basic grammar of its geology, still learning what it wanted to be. The Appalachians rose during a collision of continents so massive and so slow that the peaks they produced once stood as tall as the Himalayas, sharp, white, impossible towers of stone scraping a sky that had never once been touched by human eyes. Then, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, they wore down. The glaciers came and went. The seas rose and retreated. The continents drifted apart and the Atlantic poured itself into existence between them. Species evolved, dominated the Earth for tens of millions of years, and went extinct without ever knowing this mountain range existed. And still the Appalachians stood, quieter than they once were, rounder, gentler looking, but still there. There is something profoundly unsettling about that kind of age when you actually sit with it, when you let the numbers become real in your mind rather than just abstract geological trivia. 480 million years, a span of time so enormous that the entire human story, every war, every empire, every invention, every name anyone has ever remembered or forgotten, fits inside it the way a single sentence fits inside an encyclopedia. The Appalachians existed for 479,999,000 years before the first anatomically modern humans ever stood upright on the African savanna. Whatever these mountains are, they were already unimaginably old before we arrived. And the question that certain researchers, certain historians, certain geologists working in classified government programs have been quietly asking for over a century and a half is this: what if something else arrived first? What if something else has been here the whole time? Act 1. The mountains before history. The disappearance at Pisca. The night of September 14th, 2023 was clear and cold in Pisgah National Forest. Daniel Mercer had been planning this trip for 3 months. A 41-year-old logistics coordinator from Asheville, North Carolina, he was the kind of person who kept meticulous journals about his hiking experiences, who spent his weekends studying topographical maps the way other people studied box scores or financial reports. He had hiked more than 4,000 miles of trail over the course of his adult life. He had completed sections of the Appalachian Trail in 6 different states. He had solo backpacked in the Cascades, in the Adirondacks, in the mountains of northern New Mexico. He understood risk. He understood wilderness. He was not a beginner making a beginner's mistake. He had told his wife, Rebecca, that he would call on the morning of the 15th. He had left her a precise itinerary. He was carrying a GPS tracking device registered to a service his wife could access from her laptop at home, a service designed specifically for situations where cellular service was unavailable, transmitting his location every 30 minutes via satellite uplink. The last transmission came through at 2:13 in the morning, not because the battery died. The device's charge log showed 62% battery remaining at the time of the final transmission, not because he turned it off. The device had no off switch accessible to the user without specialized tools. The signal simply stopped. Rebecca Mercer reported her husband missing at 7:45 the following morning, when his promised call did not come. By 9:30, rangers were moving toward his last known coordinates. By early afternoon, a full search party had been assembled. Rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams, a tracking dog unit brought in from a neighbouring county. They found his campsite intact. His sleeping bag was laid out neatly, unzipped, as if he had simply stood up and stepped out into the night for a moment. His hiking boots were placed beside it, side by side, in the precise way a person arranges shoes before going to sleep. Not kicked off carelessly, but deliberately set down. His headlamp was on the ground near the tent entrance. His pack was inside, organised exactly as it would have been at the end of a hiking day. His camp stove had been used for dinner. A partially eaten meal of dehydrated pasta was still in his cook pot, scraped clean on one side and abandoned on the other, as if he had stopped eating mid-meal for some reason and simply never returned to it. The fire was still warm. Park Service personnel quietly reduced the official search radius 48 hours after the operation began, citing resource limitations. No explanation was given for why the radius was reduced rather than expanded, as is standard procedure when a missing person has not been located. The search was formally suspended after 9 days. Daniel Mercer has never been found. There is no note, no sign of an animal attack, no evidence of a fall or a medical episode, no footprints leading away from camp in any direction that the tracking dogs were willing to follow. At a certain point, a point the handlers later described with visible discomfort as approximately 150 yards from the campsite in a northwesterly direction, all 3 dogs simply stopped, sat down, refused to move forward. His file remains officially open. It sits in a drawer alongside hundreds of others just like it, stretching back through decades and centuries, a quiet archive of people who walked into these mountains and were never seen again. The age problem. To understand what may be happening beneath the Appalachian Mountains, you first need to understand what the Appalachian Mountains actually are. Not the way a travel brochure describes them. Scenic rolling hills, gorgeous fall foliage, charming small towns tucked into river valleys. Not even the way a geology textbook describes them, with their clinical language of sedimentary strata and tectonic plate convergence. You need to understand them the way a person who has spent a lifetime studying ancient rock formations and come away genuinely disturbed understands them. The Appalachians formed during an event geologists call the tectonic orogeny, which began approximately 480 million years ago. This was a period of catastrophic continental collision, when the land masses that would eventually become North America and what is now West Africa slammed into each other with geological slowness and geological violence, pushing the ocean floor up between them into mountain ranges that made today's peaks look like gentle hills. At their maximum height, roughly 350 to 400 million years ago, the Central Appalachians may have reached elevations comparable to the modern Karakoram Range, peaks approaching 25,000 feet, glaciated and ice-carved, standing in a world where the air itself was chemically different from what we breathe today. Then the continents separated, the Atlantic opened, the mountains began their long erosion, ground down over hundreds of millions of years by ice and water and the patient, remorseless weight of geological time. What remains today are the ancient roots of those original peaks. Tough, compressed, metamorphic rock that survived while everything softer was carried away to the sea. And here is where it becomes interesting. Not publicly interesting. Not interesting in the way that generates academic papers and press releases. Interesting in the way that generates quiet conversations between geologists at conferences, observations made in careful language that stops just short of stating the conclusion everyone in the room is already drawing. Certain sections of the Appalachian Range exhibit what structural geologists describe as anomalous compression patterns, rock layers that, according to standard models of tectonic pressure and erosion, should not be compressed the way they are, folded in directions that do not match the expected stress signatures of the collisions that formed them, showing evidence of forces acting from angles and directions that do not correspond to anything in the known geological record of the region. The phrase that appears in internal communications among researchers at the United States Geological Survey, never in published papers, always in emails and handwritten margin notes and conversations that the participants later declined to discuss publicly, is structural. structurally wrong. As in, sections of this mountain range in their deep interior are structurally wrong. As in, the rock is behaving as though it was shaped by something other than the geological processes we understand. No one publishes this observation. No one presents it at conferences. It exists in a quiet, uncomfortable space where professional geologists acknowledge it among themselves and then go back to their offices and write papers about things they can fully explain. But the observation does not go away. Something is wrong with these mountains, in a way that becomes more apparent the deeper you go. The voices beneath the earth, long before European settlers arrived with their compasses and their mining equipment, and their deeply inadequate understanding of what they were walking into, the people who actually knew these mountains had already drawn their conclusions. The Cherokee Nation's relationship with the Appalachian Range was ancient and complex, and held a specific quality of reverence that was distinct from the reverence they held for other sacred places. The Cherokee did not avoid these mountains. They lived in them, built their towns in the river valleys between the ridges, drew their identity and their cosmology partly from the landscape that surrounded them. They knew the Appalachians with the intimacy that comes from thousands of years of continuous presence. And there were specific places they did not go, not places they avoided out of simple superstition or unfamiliarity. Specific valleys, specific ridgelines, specific hollows accessible only through particular passes that experienced hunters and warriors would walk miles out of their way to circumvent. Places with names in the Cherokee language that do not translate cleanly into English. Names that carry connotations of something hidden, something listening, something present in a way that does not conform to the normal categories of the natural world. The oral tradition of the Cherokee passed through generations with the careful fidelity of people for whom oral transmission was the primary means of preserving knowledge, describes these places in consistent terms across different storytellers, different time periods, different parts of the mountain range. Speakers beneath the earth is a phrase that appears in multiple recorded accounts, a description not of supernatural beings in the European fairy tale sense, but of something literal and physical, something that makes sounds that travel upward through the ground, something that communicates. Hunters who entered certain valleys returned describing sounds they could not identify. Low rhythmic vibrations felt more in the chest than heard by the ear, coming from no identifiable direction, seemingly from the rock itself. Some hunters entered certain passes and did not return. Their tracks were found going in. No tracks came out. No sign of a struggle. No evidence of what had happened to them. The Shawnee, who occupied a broad range from the Ohio Valley into the Eastern Mountains, maintained similar traditions about specific Appalachian locations. Their oral accounts describe places where hunters disappeared without explanation, where the ground itself seemed to breathe, where experienced woodsmen would suddenly lose all sense of direction in terrain they knew perfectly well. Places where dogs refused to hunt, where horses refused to be led, where the normal behavioural patterns of every animal species broke down completely. Certain ridges were abandoned, certain valleys were forbidden. The knowledge of which places these were and why they were dangerous was passed carefully from generation to generation, treated with the seriousness of life or death practical information rather than the narrative looseness of mythology. These were not stories, these were warnings. No one among the European settlers who began arriving in significant numbers in the 18th century bothered to ask why. Act 2. The first discoveries, the surveyor's notes, 1770s. The systematic European exploration of the Appalachian interior began in earnest during the 1770s, driven by land speculation, colonial expansion, and the practical need to understand a mountain range that formed a significant geographic barrier between the established eastern settlements and the vast interior of the continent. The surveyors and explorers who pushed into the mountain wilderness during this period were not naive men. They were experienced frontier navigators, skilled woodsmen, people accustomed to the genuine physical dangers of the American wilderness: bears, catamounts, hostile encounters, exposure, injury far from any medical help. They were the kind of people who recorded their experiences with practical precision, noting compass headings and water sources and terrain features with the same matter-of-fact attention they would have given to listing the contents of their supply packs, which makes the anomalies in their journals all the more striking. Among the most famous figures of this period was Daniel Boone, whose journeys through the Cumberland Gap and into the Kentucky interior brought him through some of the most remote and least known sections of the Appalachian Range. Boone was not given to fancy or exaggeration. His recorded observations have been verified by historians as generally reliable and meticulously precise. He was, in the clearest possible sense, a trustworthy witness. His journals from certain expeditions now held in historical archives contain entries that do not fit neatly alongside the practical frontier navigation that characterises most of his writing. There are references to compass behaviour that he describes with evident puzzlement, instruments spinning freely in their housings in locations where no natural explanation was apparent, disorienting navigation in terrain where his own considerable woodsman skill could not compensate for the inability to establish direction. These weren't isolated incidents he dismissed as equipment malfunction. They occurred repeatedly, in specific locations, in a manner consistent enough that he began to note the geographic coordinates of the affected areas in his journals as places requiring special navigational caution. There are references to sounds at night, sounds emerging from the hollows and valleys below his camping positions described as a low hum or vibration that he associated with no known natural phenomenon. Not wind, not water, not the sounds of large animals moving through underbrush. Something he had no word for, described with the careful precision of a man trying to report something accurately, despite having no adequate vocabulary for it. And there are references to animal behaviour that Boone, who had spent his adult life reading the behaviour of wild animals as a survival tool, found inexplicable. Horses refusing to enter specific passes despite being perfectly willing to traverse much more challenging terrain in other locations. Dogs that hunted eagerly everywhere else, simply lying down and refusing to move when brought into certain valleys. Deer and elk absent from areas that appeared to offer ideal habitat, as if the animals had been avoiding these locations for so long that their avoidance had become encoded in their local behavioural patterns. These observations do not appear in the official records compiled from Boone's expeditions. They appear in his personal journals, documents that were not originally intended for publication or official use. Some of the most specific entries in the original journals have been noted by historians as absent from the transcriptions that were made and preserved for the historical record. Someone, at some point, made a decision about what should be remembered and what should not. Boone was not the only surveyor making these observations. The records of frontier mapping expeditions throughout the 1770s and 1780s contain scattered references to compass anomalies, unexplained sounds, and animal behaviour that experienced woodsmen found impossible to explain through conventional means. These references appear in journals and personal letters. They rarely appear in official reports. The omissions are consistent enough to suggest a pattern, not a conspiracy necessarily, not yet, simply a shared, perhaps unconscious decision among practical men that certain observations were too strange to be useful, too inexplicable to be creditable, better left out of the official record where they might cast doubt on the reliability of the reporter. But taken together, these scattered accounts from the first systematic exploration of the Appalachian interior describe a range of phenomena: electromagnetic anomalies, acoustic anomalies, anomalous animal behaviour, that cluster in specific geographic locations, reappear consistently across different observers and different time periods, and resist any conventional explanation. The mountains were trying to tell the early explorers something. The early explorers, for the most part, chose not to listen. The Lost Tunnel reports, 1800 to 1830. By the early 19th century, the economic potential of the Appalachian Mountains had become a primary driver of their exploration. Coal, iron, copper, salt. The region's mineral wealth was enormous, and as the young American Republic expanded and industrialized, the demand for those resources drove men deeper into the mountains and deeper into the earth than the frontier surveyors had ventured. The mining operations that spread across Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia and Tennessee during the first decades of the 19th century were rough, dangerous enterprises by any standard. The men who worked them were accustomed to underground environments that would have terrified most people. Low ceilings, bad air, the constant possibility of collapse, the disorienting darkness that settled over you the moment your lamp went out. They were not easily frightened. They were not prone to reporting things that made them sound unstable or unreliable. Because in an industry where your safety depended on your co-workers' trust in your judgment, a reputation for seeing things could be genuinely dangerous. Which is why the reports that emerge from certain mines during this period are so difficult to dismiss. The pattern repeated itself in mining operations across multiple states, separated by geography and time, conducted by different companies with different workforces. Miners breaking through to natural cave systems was not unusual. The Appalachian region is riddled with limestone caverns, and encountering them during underground excavation was a routine occupational hazard. What was not routine was what certain mining crews found when they broke through into specific cave systems in specific locations. Natural cave formation follows predictable rules. Caves form in limestone through the action of slightly acidic water dissolving the rock over long periods of time. The passages they create are irregular, shaped by the random flow of water, narrowing and widening unpredictably, following the path of least resistance through the stone. The walls of natural caves show the scalloping and rippling produced by water flow, the stalactites and stalagmites produced by mineral deposition, the rough, organic irregularity of a system shaped by the blind operation of chemistry and physics. The systems that certain miners broke into were different. The walls were smooth in a way that water erosion does not produce, a quality that experienced cave explorers, when they were later brought in to examine the systems, struggled to explain. Not polished precisely, but worn in a manner that suggested long passage rather than water flow. The angles of the passages were unusual, descending at grades that seemed deliberately measured, maintaining consistent widths over distances that natural cave systems simply do not maintain. The geometry was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, but immediately apparent to anyone who had spent significant time in natural cave systems. Miners reported warm air currents rising from deep within these systems, not the cool, stable temperatures characteristic of natural caves, but warmth that increased with depth, suggesting a heat source far below that defied geological explanation in regions where no volcanic activity existed, and no mining operation reached deep enough to encounter geothermal heating. Sounds carried through these systems in ways that disturbed the men who heard them. Not the dripping of water or the settling of stone that miners were accustomed to hearing underground, but rhythmic, patterned vibrations that some described as resembling, distantly and eerily, something like breathing, something like a heartbeat translated into the language of stone. Several mines were abruptly abandoned following the discovery of these systems. The owners cited various practical reasons. The passage had not led to productive mineral seams. The geological formation was unstable. The expense of further excavation outweighed the likely return. In most cases, the government, first territorial, then state, then federal as the relevant areas achieved statehood, acquired the mineral rights to the abandoned properties within months of their closure. The timing, repeated across multiple locations over multiple decades, was noticed by at least some of the people involved. But what could be done with the observation? The rights were acquired legally. The prices paid were fair. There was nothing to contest, no law broken, no complaint with any obvious remedy. The properties passed into government hands. The access tunnels were sealed. The records of what had been found inside were filed away under classifications that would not be invented for another 100 years, stored in a bureaucratic system that was still learning how to make things disappear. ACE 3. The Civil War Secret. The Confederate Mining Collapse, 1863. The American Civil War brought industrial-scale excavation to the Appalachian region on a scale that the earlier mining operations had not approached. Both the Confederate and Union sides had critical military need for the iron, coal, and saltpeter that the mountains contained, and both sides pushed their mining operations harder than peacetime economics would have justified. In the spring of 1863, in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, a hidden Confederate iron mine collapsed. The word hidden here is significant. This was not a registered commercial operation. It was a military extraction site, its location kept from Union intelligence, operating under conditions of secrecy that meant its existence was officially denied, and its documentation was minimal and classified at the highest levels available to the Confederate military administration. The collapse itself was catastrophic. 37 men were underground at the time, working a seam that the military engineers had assessed as safe based on the geological surveys available to them. The cave-in happened suddenly, without the warning signs that usually preceded such events. No preliminary cracking of support timbers, no preliminary settling of the floor that would have told experienced miners to get out. The roof came down all at once as if something had simply decided to close. Rescue teams were assembled immediately. The Confederate military could not afford to lose 37 trained men and a working iron operation, and the engineers who led the rescue operation were skilled and motivated. What they found stopped them. The collapse had exposed a cavern system that the original mine excavation had not detected, a system that, as the rescue teams worked their way through the fallen stone trying to reach the trapped miners, revealed itself to be far larger than any natural cave formation should have been in that specific geological context. The engineers estimated, from what they could see, that the chambers extended downward at an angle that would have placed their lower reaches several hundred feet below the mine floor, below the depth at which the limestone formations that typically produced cave systems in the region even existed. The walls of the exposed chambers displayed the same smooth quality that miners in Kentucky and West Virginia had reported 40 years earlier, a quality that the Confederate engineers, who had extensive experience with natural cave systems, immediately identified as anomalous. The geometry of the passages, what they could see of it before the rescuers were ordered to stop advancing, was too regular. The metallic echoing was what ended the operation. Several of the engineers and senior rescuers heard it separately, and described it independently in language that converged on the same impression. A sound coming from deep within the exposed chambers, metallic in character, rhythmic in pattern, resembling nothing that should have been present in an unmined, uninhabited underground space. Not the sound of water, not the sound of settling rock, not the sound of the trapped miners, who would have been making very different sounds if any of them were still alive and capable of making noise. Something that sounded to multiple independent witnesses like a pattern, like something being produced deliberately. The workers refused to continue the rescue operation. The engineers tried everything. Appeals to duty, threats of military discipline, physical compulsion, and accomplished nothing. The men who had gone furthest into the exposed system simply would not go back. Several of them resigned from the Confederate service entirely rather than return to that mine. The rescue was formally abandoned. No official reason was given for why the effort to recover 37 men was halted before all possible options had been exhausted. The war records pertaining to this incident were classified under the Federal Reconstruction Archives following the Union victory. The Confederate military records absorbed into the federal system and immediately sealed under classifications that would keep them inaccessible to researchers for more than a century. The 37 miners were never recovered. Their names appear on no memorial. The Federal Geological Survey, 1872. The formation of the United States Geological Survey in 1879, with significant survey work beginning several years earlier in the 1870s, represented the first systematic, scientifically rigorous effort by the federal government to understand the geology of the American West and interior. For our purposes, what matters is what happened when early survey scientists turned their attention to the Appalachians. The Appalachians presented a different kind of scientific challenge than the dramatic landscapes of the West. They were old, familiar, heavily settled, a mountain range that had been part of the American consciousness since the first colonial settlements. Whatever they contained had been there all along, weathered down by geological time, apparently offering no dramatic new mysteries of the kind the West was producing. The early survey geologists quickly discovered they were wrong. Deep subsurface analysis of the Appalachian Range, using the seismic and geological techniques available at the time, which were cruder than modern methods but already capable of detecting large-scale underground structures, revealed something that the survey's internal documents begin referring to, by the early 1880s, as the subsurface void network. The language is careful. Void network is a neutral term that simply describes a connected series of underground empty spaces, which could, in principle, simply mean a large cave system. But the survey geologists were not describing a large cave system in the normal sense. The voids they were detecting were too large, too deep, too regularly distributed. Their spacing along the mountain range was consistent in a way that natural cave formation, which follows the random distribution of soluble rock and water flow, simply does not produce. The internal notes of the geologists who first mapped these features use the word symmetrical, with an anxiety that is almost palpable even through the formal scientific language of the period. Cave systems are not symmetrical. The forces that produce them are random, uneven, governed by the specific local conditions of water chemistry and rock composition. A symmetrical cave system is, in the strictest geological sense, a contradiction in terms. The subsurface void network was symmetrical. The survey's official published reports from this period contain nothing about these findings. What appears in the archives, in the internal correspondence, the unpublished field notes, the annotated maps that were stamped for internal use only and filed away from the documents intended for public distribution, tells a very different story than what the survey was telling the public. The voids extend from somewhere in northern Alabama to somewhere in southern Pennsylvania. They run, with remarkable consistency, along a north-south axis that correlates almost precisely with the axis of the mountain range above them. They lie at depths ranging from several hundred to several thousand feet below the surface, too deep to be affected by the surface geology in ways that would explain their formation. The survey geologists who made these observations wrote to each other about them in language that, for scientists of that era, amounts to expressions of profound disquiet. They had no explanation. They did not publish their findings. They did not present them at scientific meetings. They filed them away, classified them internally as sensitive, and moved on to other projects. The subsurface void network sat in the archives waiting to be found again. Est 4. The humans who went missing. The pattern in the disappearances. Take a map of the Appalachian Range. Starting from northern Georgia, draw a line northward through the Great Smoky Mountains, through the Blue Ridge, through Shenandoah, through the mountains of central Pennsylvania. Mark on this map every documented disappearance of a person in the wilderness of this region from 1870 to the present day. Every hiker, every hunter, every child, every camper who walked into these mountains and did not come back. You will notice something. The disappearances are not distributed randomly across the mountain range. They cluster. They cluster in specific locations along a north-south corridor that runs with disturbing consistency through the same areas that the early survey geologists identified as locations of the subsurface void network. The same areas where Daniel Boone noted compass anomalies in the 1770s. The same areas where mining operations were abandoned in the early 1800s. The same areas where Cherokee and Shawnee oral tradition placed their forbidden valleys and their warnings about what lay beneath the earth. Researchers who have analysed these disappearances in detail, notably the author David Paulides, whose multi-volume work on the subject has attracted significant attention among both serious researchers and the broader public interested in unexplained phenomena, have noted a series of characteristics that appear with unusual consistency across cases separated by decades and geography. The circumstances of these disappearances tend to resist the conventional explanations that usually account for wilderness fatalities. People get lost in wilderness areas. People fall and injure themselves. People underestimate weather or terrain and make fatal errors. These are the ordinary tragedies of wilderness experience, and they leave behind evidence. Search dogs can track a person who walked away from a trail. Medical examiners can determine cause of death when a body is found. The normal investigative tools of search and rescue can usually reconstruct what happened. In the cases that cluster along the Appalachian corridor, the normal investigative tools fail. Dogs refuse to track, not lose the scent, refuse. Experienced tracking dogs that have worked hundreds of cases simply sit down and will not proceed in certain directions. This behaviour, reported by handlers who describe it with visible discomfort in interviews, occurs at specific geographic boundaries, as if the animals are encountering something they recognise as a line they will not cross. Bodies, when found, are sometimes discovered in locations that search teams had already covered, in areas that rescuers are certain they searched, in terrain that an incapacitated person could not have reached, in positions that suggest they were placed rather than that they fell or crawled to where they were found. Children who are found alive sometimes describe experiences that are impossible to reconcile with what their physical condition suggests should have happened. Children who should have been suffering from extreme exposure after days in wilderness conditions are found warm and uninjured. Children who could not have walked the distances involved are found miles from where they disappeared. Some of them describe encounters with the people in the woods, accounts that investigators file under the assumption that children, traumatized and disoriented, create explanations for experiences they cannot understand. The pattern holds across more than 150 years of documented cases. The corridor is consistent. The clustering is statistically significant enough that it has been noticed by National Park Service researchers who have, to date, declined to publish or formally acknowledge their findings. Whatever is happening in these mountains, it has been happening for a very long time. The Civilian Conservation Corps, 1930s. The Great Depression brought the federal government into the Appalachian Mountains in a new and systematic way. President Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was one of the signature programs of the New Deal era, employing hundreds of thousands of young men from across the country in conservation and infrastructure work throughout America's national forests and parks. In the Appalachians, CCC crews built the trail systems, fire roads, and park infrastructure that millions of visitors still use today. They worked in some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the mountain range, living in camps that were often far from any town, spending months in a landscape that most of them had never experienced before. The records of the CCC's Appalachian operations are extensive and well preserved. The agency maintained detailed logs, correspondence, and personal accounts. It was, in many ways, a thoroughly documented organisation, which makes the gaps in those records all the more noticeable to researchers who look for them. Several camp journals, the day-to-day operational logs kept by camp supervisors, have been lost from the archives in a manner that the records management officials responsible for these collections have never been able to explain. Not damaged or deteriorated, not misfiled, simply absent from collections where their presence is documented in finding aids and inventories prepared before they disappeared. Among the surviving accounts, personal letters, diaries kept by individual workers, oral histories collected by later researchers, a consistent set of observations appears with a frequency that cannot be attributed to the folklore transmission that inevitably occurs when large numbers of people live closely together. Workers at certain camps in certain locations reported lights moving through the forest at night. Not lights associated with any known human activity. No lanterns or torches carried by other CCC workers or local residents. No vehicle headlights on roads that did not yet exist. No explanation that anyone involved considered satisfactory. Lights moving at heights and speeds and in patterns that did not correspond to any natural phenomenon the workers knew. Workers reported feeling vibrations through the ground, a low-frequency oscillation that they could feel through their boots and bedrolls but could not hear clearly, a sensation described consistently as something happening deep underground, not nearby. Workers who slept on bare earth reported these vibrations waking them at night. Workers who mentioned the vibrations to supervisors found the subject quickly redirected. In at least 3 documented instances, work crews assigned to specific areas were suddenly and without explanation reassigned to locations miles away from their original work site. The reassignments came from above the level of local supervision, from regional CCC administrators who offered no explanation to the camp supervisors other than a restatement of the order. In 2 of these cases, the workers who'd been removed never returned to their original sites. In the 3rd case, workers who were briefly returned to finish specific tasks reported that the area felt different, that something about the landscape had changed that they could not specifically identify, but that made all of them uneasy. The CCC supervisors who documented any of this in their official reports found their reports reviewed and edited before filing. The nature of the edits, in cases where both draft and final version survive, is consistent. Specific observations about unexplained phenomena were removed, replaced with bland notations about routine operational decisions. Act 5. World War II Discovery Signal Interference, 1943. By the early 1940s, the electromagnetic strangeness of certain Appalachian locations had become more than a nuisance. It had become a military problem. The United States Army, preparing for the possibility that American soil might become a theatre of war and training personnel in the communications technologies that modern warfare required, established training installations throughout the eastern United States. The Appalachian region was a natural choice, remote enough for realistic field conditions, accessible enough for logistics, with terrain that provided useful challenges for training troops who might eventually operate in mountainous European environments. The communication difficulties began almost immediately. Radio communication, which was by 1943 a primary operational tool of the modern military, essential for battlefield coordination, behaved in the Appalachian training areas in ways that should not have been possible. In specific geographic zones, radio signals were absorbed, reflected, or distorted by mechanisms that the Army Signal Corps engineers assigned to investigate the problem could not identify. The interference was not caused by weather, which was the standard explanation for radio anomalies. It was not caused by natural geological features in any way that the available science could explain. It occurred in specific locations with specific consistency, regardless of atmospheric conditions. The phenomenon that most disturbed the Signal Corps investigators was what they called delayed echo transmission. Radio signals broadcast into certain mountain zones returned as echoes, which, in itself, was not unprecedented, as radio wave reflection from geological features was a known phenomenon. What was unprecedented was the delay. Natural radio wave reflections return almost instantaneously. The echoes occurring in the Appalachian anomaly zones returned with delays measured in minutes. For a radio wave travelling at the speed of light, a delay of minutes implies a propagation path of millions of miles. There was nothing, in any direction, that should have been reflecting these signals at that distance. The signals were being transmitted into the mountains and returning from somewhere that the physics of electromagnetic wave propagation did not allow. The Signal Corps filed classified reports. Monitoring equipment was installed at several locations in the worst affected zones. The areas were designated in military communication as electromagnetic irregularity zones, a designation that triggered specific protocols for communication routing that would avoid the affected areas without requiring personnel to know the specific reason for the routing. The underlying explanation for what was happening in these zones was never found. The monitoring equipment, upgraded and expanded over the following decades, continued to document anomalies without explaining them. The installation of that monitoring equipment, however, had a side effect that no one initially anticipated. The equipment was listening, and the equipment began to pick up transmissions it was not meant to receive. Project Deep Echo. The program that would eventually be formalised as Project Deep Echo began as an informal working group within the Army Signal Corps in late 1945, as the end of World War II redirected the energies of the military's scientific establishment toward questions that the urgency of wartime had not allowed them to explore. The core of the program's interest was the acoustic and electromagnetic data being recorded by the monitoring stations installed in the Appalachian irregularity zones. The delayed echo transmissions had continued throughout the war. The monitoring equipment, sensitive enough to detect extremely low-frequency signals, was also picking up something else, a consistent signal emanating not from the surface or the atmosphere, but from underground. The signal was not random noise. Random noise from underground sources, geological activity, hydrological movement, the various sounds a planet makes as it shifts and settles, has a characteristic randomness that can be mathematically analysed and confirmed. The signal the monitoring stations were detecting did not have that characteristic. It had what acoustical engineers describe as temporal structure, patterns of varying intensity and frequency that recur in ways that random noise does not. Project Deep Echo was formally established in the late 1940s with a mandate to determine the origin of these signals. The classified program brought together acoustical engineers, geophysicists, seismologists, and a category of specialists that the program's classified budget documents describe simply as xenobiological consultants, a term that appears without further elaboration in the surviving documentation. The program's primary technical achievement was the systematic use of controlled seismic events, essentially precisely measured underground explosions, to map the subsurface of the Appalachian Range using the reflection of seismic waves from underground structures. The technique was available for decades and had been used extensively in oil and gas exploration. What made the Project Deep Echo surveys different was their scale, their depth, and their geographic coverage. The results confirmed and dramatically exceeded what the United States Geological Survey had detected in the 1880s. The subsurface void network was real. It was larger than the survey's early mapping had suggested, far larger. The chamber system extended from somewhere in northern Alabama to somewhere in central Pennsylvania, following the axis of the mountain range with a consistency that the program's geophysicists described in their reports as impossible to attribute to natural geological processes. The chambers were connected by passage systems at multiple depths. The deepest chambers mapped by the seismic surveys lay at depths that put them well below any geological formation that should have produced a void of their size, and the chambers were too symmetrical. The word appears again and again in the Project Deep Echo documentation, each time with the same uncomfortable quality of a word being used to describe something the writer knows should not exist. The chambers were too symmetrical, the passages too regular, the overall architecture of the system too consistent across too great a distance to be the product of the geological forces that produce natural cave systems. The program's xenobiological consultants, whoever they were, whatever that title actually meant, produced a classified assessment that is referenced but not reproduced in the surviving documentation. The assessment's conclusions are described in the program director's summary report as consistent with the hypothesis that the structures predate the current configuration of the mountain range and incompatible with natural geological formation under any process currently understood. The structures in the Appalachian subsurface were not formed by geology. They were there before the mountains existed in their current form. Whatever made them when the Appalachians were still young, or possibly even before, during the hundreds of millions of years of geological time that preceded any species capable of making such structures. The program continued. AST 6. The Cold War years. Underground infrastructure. 1950s and 1960s. The Cold War provided the United States government with a remarkably convenient justification for a significant escalation of its activities in the Appalachian region. The nuclear threat posed by the Soviet Union made the construction of hardened underground facilities for government continuity and military command an obvious and easily defended expenditure. Congress appropriated funds. Engineering firms with the highest security clearances were contracted, and across a 2-decade span, the mountains of the American East became home to one of the most extensive underground construction programs in the world. The publicly known examples are significant. The Greenbrier facility in West Virginia, which operated as a secret congressional relocation center for more than 3 decades before being exposed by a Washington Post investigative report in 1992, gives some sense of the scale of the effort. Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, which continues to operate as an alternate Pentagon command center. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, a primary continuity of government facility that has never been fully open to public inspection. These are the facilities the public knows about. They are presented as the Cold War government's response to the nuclear threat. Isolated, purpose-built underground bunkers constructed from scratch in convenient mountain locations. But engineers who worked on some of these projects, engineers whose security clearances have long since lapsed, who are now in their 70s and 80s and talking to the people who will listen, describe a consistent anomaly in the construction process. The facilities that were built in specific locations that, when mapped, correspond with uncomfortable precision to the nodes of the subsurface void network, did not require the same amount of initial excavation that comparable facilities in other locations required. In some cases, what the construction crews expected to be months of rock removal was accomplished in days, because the rock that should have been there had, in effect, already been removed. Natural chambers of the right size and configuration existed in exactly the right locations, as if they had been placed there to receive the government facilities that would one day be built inside them. This is not the kind of observation that gets put in official construction reports, but it gets mentioned, quietly, in the oral accounts of people who were there. The official explanation for the Cold War underground construction program in the Appalachians was nuclear preparedness. The facilities were built to survive nuclear attack and maintain government continuity. This is true as far as it goes. What the official explanation does not address is why specific locations were chosen over others that were geologically equivalent. What it does not address is the internal documentation, preserved in classified archives that researchers have accessed through partial Freedom of Information Act requests, suggesting that site selection for these facilities was guided by something other than the surface geology and engineering assessments that are the standard criteria for underground construction. The facilities were built where they were built because the government knew what was already there. The Cold War gave them the cover story. The program gave them the access points, and the access, once established, went both ways. The Appalachian Sounds. By the 1950s, something had changed in the acoustic character of the mountain range. The residents of rural West Virginia and Kentucky, the people who lived in the hollows and valleys between the ridges, who had lived there for generations, who knew the sounds of the mountains the way they knew the sounds of their own breathing, began reporting something new, not unprecedented. Their grandparents had told stories of sounds from the deep hollows, of vibrations felt through bare feet on warm summer nights, of low humming that the old-timers associated with the mountains themselves in the same way they associated the creek sound with the creek. These were old stories, embedded in the folklore of mountain communities with roots going back 2 centuries. But the sounds that people were reporting in the 1950s were louder, more frequent, and they were coming from places that had previously been quiet. The descriptions that appear in local newspaper accounts, in letters to county officials, in the records of state geological surveys that were occasionally dispatched to investigate complaints, are remarkably consistent. A low, resonant droning, not the high-frequency buzz of insects or the sharp sounds of mechanical equipment, but something felt as much as heard, a vibration that entered the body through the feet and the chest rather than the ears, coming from below the ground at a frequency that conventional audio equipment struggled to capture clearly. Trumpet noises is a phrase that appears repeatedly in the accounts, an attempt by people without technical vocabulary to describe something that vaguely resembled the lowest register of a brass instrument, but came from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the ground itself, at times of day and night when no natural acoustic explanation was available. The official response from state and federal geological authorities was consistent. The sounds were attributed to coal mining operations, to the natural settling of rock formations, to atmospheric acoustic phenomena. These explanations were delivered with the confident authority of institutional science and accepted, officially, by the agencies and newspapers that received them. Internally, the picture was different. An internal memorandum from a federal geophysical research agency, partially released in a Freedom of Information Act response in 2008, with significant portions redacted, describes monitoring data from the Appalachian Acoustic Surveillance Network that contradicts the public explanation. The membrane states, in the portion available to researchers, that the sounds being reported by residents originate below the depth of active mining operations in all affected counties, and that their acoustic signature is inconsistent with any mechanical or geological source currently operated or known to exist in the relevant geographic areas. Below the depth of mining operations, inconsistent with any known source. The memo is dated 1959. The sounds continue to be reported to this day. Act 7. The creature theory, the wildlife reports. Not all of what has been observed in the Appalachian wilderness fits neatly into the category of acoustic or electromagnetic phenomena. There is another category of observation, stretching across more than a century of documented reports, that requires a different kind of explanation. Game wardens and park rangers, the people who spend the most time in the most remote sections of the mountain range, whose professional lives are organised around observing and understanding wildlife, have filed, in numbers large enough to constitute a pattern, reports of encounters with something that does not belong in any existing wildlife catalogue. The descriptions share common features with a consistency that cannot be attributed to folklore transmission among professional wildlife managers who typically have no contact with each other's reports. Figures that are unmistakably not the wildlife species known to inhabit the region. Tall, pale, thin, taller than any human, with a quality of movement that witnesses consistently describe as fundamentally different from either human or animal locomotion, as if the mechanics of how it moves through space don't follow the same principles that govern the movement of every other living thing the observer has encountered. The eye reflection reports are particularly striking. Wildlife eyes reflect light in the dark. It's a function of the tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer behind the retina that improves vision in low-light conditions. Every experienced outdoors person knows what animal eye reflection looks like, and can generally identify species by the colour and intensity of the reflected light. The eye reflection described in these reports occurs without an external light source. In absolute darkness, where there is nothing to reflect, the observers nevertheless report seeing eyes that appear to emit their own pale luminescence, watching from distances at which the resolution of the visual image should not be possible. Movement through cliff faces. This detail appears in more than a dozen independent reports from different geographic locations across different time periods, and it is the detail that makes these accounts most difficult to process rationally. Witnesses describe seeing figures that appear to pass into or out of solid rock, moving through the face of a cliff or stone outcropping as if the surface were permeable, leaving no trace of an opening behind them. The witnesses who report this are not, in most cases, people who have any interest in reporting unusual things. They are professional wildlife managers, law enforcement officers, military personnel conducting exercises in the area. They are people for whom seeing something inexplicable is professionally awkward rather than exciting. These reports were filed through official channels. They were processed through the standard wildlife incident documentation system, and somewhere in that system they received a classification that does not appear in the standard wildlife incident taxonomy, a designation stamped across the relevant files in a form that appears in the surviving documents as two words that someone, at some point, decided constituted an adequate category. Subterranean fauna. Whatever these things are, someone in the federal wildlife management system decided they were fauna, living things, and that they were subterranean, and whoever made that decision made it within the existing bureaucratic framework, assigning a category to something that should have prompted an entirely new framework, as if the acknowledgement could be safely contained by the act of naming it. The biological hypothesis. The classified biological assessment that Project Deep Echo produced in the early 1950s represents, as far as can be determined from the surviving documentation, the first formal government attempt to understand what the Appalachian anomalies actually were in terms of a living hypothesis. The hypothesis that emerges from the programme's documentation, reconstructed from references in summary reports, budget justifications, and the partial FOIA releases that have become available over the past 3 decades, is this. During the Appalachian mountain range's original formation, approximately 400 to 500 million years ago, an isolated environment was created in the deep subsurface that persisted as the surface geology changed above it. This environment, the subsurface void network, maintained stable conditions over geological timespans that make all of recorded human history look like a rounding error. In that environment, in conditions of total darkness and extreme geological stability, over hundreds of millions of years, a biological lineage evolved. The lineage's origin is the most contested element of the hypothesis. The biological assessment, as referenced in the surviving documentation, apparently considered multiple possibilities, from an independent origin of complex life that ran parallel to the surface evolutionary history, to a divergence from surface species that occurred so long ago that the two lineages share nothing recognizable, to something stranger that the summary reports decline to specify. What the assessment apparently concluded is that whatever the lineage's origin, it has had hundreds of millions of years to develop adaptations suited to its environment. Those adaptations, as reconstructed from the biological assessment references, are striking. Vision optimized for environments where bioluminescent biological sources, rather than external light, are the primary visual input, which would explain the eye reflection reports, and would explain why the reflection appears to be emitted rather than reflected in standard optical terms. Acoustic sensitivity and production capability far beyond what surface species have developed. The ability to produce and receive extremely low-frequency sound that travels efficiently through rock and earth, sound that humans feel rather than hear, sound that can propagate through the subsurface void network over distances of hundreds of miles. Spatial navigation ability based on acoustic mapping of underground environments, essentially a sophisticated biological sonar capable of constructing and maintaining detailed 3-dimensional models of complex underground terrain, allowing movement through the subterranean system with precision that surface humans with the best available technology cannot match, and a behavioural pattern, apparently deeply encoded relating to the surface world and the surface organisms that periodically enter the mountain wilderness above the subsurface void network. The biological assessment's conclusion on this point, as referenced in the programme director's summary, is that human entry into certain geographic zones above the network triggers what the assessment describes as defensive survey response. Not an aggressive predatory response, not an attack, something more careful than that, and in some ways more disturbing, an observation response. Act 8. The modern investigation. The journalist Evan Calder spent 3 years building the case before he understood what case he was actually building. He had started where most serious researchers into Appalachian disappearances start, with the data itself, the raw numbers and geographic coordinates of missing persons cases, the frustrating patterns that kept emerging from the statistics and kept resisting the conventional explanations that official sources offered. He was a podcast producer and investigative journalist with a specific talent for the kind of patient, detail-oriented research that turns a scatterplot of apparently unrelated data points into a coherent argument. He had the missing persons data. He had the historical records of mine enclosures and land acquisitions. He had the partial FOIA releases from the Geological Survey archives, including the fragments that referenced the subsurface void network, without ever fully describing what it contained. He had the acoustic monitoring reports with their careful language about sounds originating below mining depth. The alignment came to him gradually, and then all at once. The missing persons clusters matched the subsurface void network mapping almost exactly. The mining closures of the early 19th century mapped onto the network nodes. The land acquisitions that followed those closures mapped onto the network nodes. The military training areas designated as electromagnetic irregularity zones during World War II mapped onto the network nodes. The Cold War underground facilities mapped onto the network nodes. Everything mapped onto the same underlying geography. Everything that the federal government had been doing in the Appalachian region for 2 centuries, the acquisitions, the designations, the facilities, the monitoring, had been organised around a geographic framework that the public did not know existed. Calder spent 6 months attempting to get official responses from the relevant agencies. The National Park Service did not respond. The United States Geological Survey provided standard public information documents. The Department of Defense declined to comment on classified programs. The responses were precisely calibrated to provide the appearance of engagement without providing any actual information. He decided to go see for himself. The restricted valley. The hollow Calder chose to investigate was not on any public trail map. It appeared in the survey's public geographic databases as a blank, a section of terrain within the national forest boundary that the available record simply failed to document, as if a small geographic area had been editorially removed from the official record of what existed in that part of the mountains. He had found references to it in a CCC-era internal document, a memo from a camp supervisor to a regional administrator, discussing a work crew's unexpected encounter with a geographic feature that the supervisor described as a thermally anomalous depression with magnetic interference characteristics. The supervisor had been seeking guidance on whether to include the hollow in trail planning. The guidance he received in the annotated response returned to him and preserved in the archive was a single word: no. Calder hiked in from a secondary trailhead, moving off trail through second-growth forest on a clear October morning. The temperature at the trailhead was 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cool but comfortable for hiking, appropriate for the elevation and the season. He carried a GPS device, a compass, a thermal imaging camera, and audio recording equipment sensitive enough to capture infrasound frequencies below the normal range of human hearing. The temperature drop began approximately a mile from the coordinates he was targeting. Not a gradual change consistent with increasing elevation, or the movement into a shaded valley. A relatively sudden decrease of approximately 12 degrees over a horizontal distance of less than a quarter mile, crossing what appeared to be an invisible boundary in the forest. The trees on either side of the boundary were identical in species and size. The terrain showed no feature that would explain the temperature differential. His compass failed at approximately the same point. Not spinning, the way the frontier surveyors had reported, simply ceasing to indicate north with any consistency, the needle drifting and settling in directions that bore no relationship to any consistent reference point. He switched to his GPS device, which continued to provide coordinates, but noted that the device's internal compass function had also ceased to function correctly. The sound reached him before he was within visual range of the hollow itself. Low is an inadequate word for what he recorded. The audio data from that day, which Calder later had analysed by an acoustics laboratory, whose staff had worked with NASA's infrasound monitoring network, showed energy concentrated primarily in the range of 0.1 to 2 Hz. Frequencies so low that human hearing cannot detect them in the conventional sense. Frequencies that are perceived by the body as vibration rather than sound, entering through bone conduction and proprioception rather than through the ear. The vibration was consistent, rhythmic, structured. The acoustics lab report describes its temporal pattern as non-random, with a period consistent with biological rather than geological rhythmic processes. A careful scientific way of saying that it had a rhythm, and that the rhythm resembled a heartbeat more than it resembled anything a rock formation produces. The thermal camera showed something he had not anticipated. The surface of the hollow was normal, rock and soil and fallen leaves showing thermal signatures consistent with the ambient temperature of the space. But approximately 4 meters below the surface, the thermal camera was detecting movement. Not geological movement, not the slow thermal differential produced by underground water flow or geothermal gradients. Movement that changed position between frames, that appeared and disappeared, that followed trajectories consistent with something navigating a space rather than with any passive thermal process. Something was moving beneath the ground. Calder stayed for 2 hours. He did not see anything on the surface of the hollow. He heard nothing audible in the conventional sense, but the infrasound continued the entire time he was there, and the thermal camera continued to show movement below the surface. And then, as he was preparing to leave, it stopped. Everything stopped. The infrasound cut out as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The thermal camera showed nothing below the surface. The forest around the hollow went silent in the way that forests go silent when every living thing in them simultaneously decides that something significant has happened. He packed his equipment and left quickly, not running, but moving with the focused urgency of someone who understands, on a level below rational analysis, that they should not be where they are. He did not look back. Act 9. The revelation. The declassified fragment. The document arrived in response to a Freedom of Information Act request that Calder had submitted 14 months earlier and largely forgotten about, buried in a queue of similar requests that typically produced either a formal denial or a stack of heavily redacted papers offering nothing of substance. This response was different. The release was partial. 4 pages out of what the cover sheet indicated had been a document of considerably greater length, with the remaining pages withheld under exemption citing national security and internal government deliberations. The redactions within the 4 available pages were extensive, black bars covering passages of text that could be sensed but not read, blocks of deleted material that represented entire paragraphs, entire sections of analysis and observation that someone had decided, even after more than 50 years, could not be shared with the public. But enough remained. The document was headed Appalachian Subsurface Monitoring Directive, 1971. The agency of origin had been redacted. The names of the signatories had been redacted. The specific program designation had been redacted. What remained was a fragment of bureaucratic language that had the quality of all the most significant government documents: dry, careful, precise, written in the specific style of people who know that what they are describing is extraordinary and have determined that the best way to manage that extraordinariness is to describe it in language so ordinary that it disappears into the bureaucratic background noise. Several lines in the surviving text have been reproduced in Calder's published account of his research and have been verified as authentic by document authentication specialists who examined the original release. One line reads, "Contact avoidance remains primary objective." A second reads, "Population stable, behavioural patterns consistent with previous reporting periods." A third reads, "Surface awareness unacceptable, remediation protocols to be maintained." Calder stared at these 3 sentences for a very long time before he understood what they meant. Not individually. Individually, they were impenetrable in the way that all bureaucratic language is impenetrable, drained of context and specificity by the redaction surrounding them. Together, they told a story. Contact avoidance remains primary objective. There is something to avoid contact with. The avoidance of contact is not an accident, not a passive consequence of the something's behaviour, but an active goal, a primary objective, the most important thing the program is trying to accomplish. Someone has decided, and someone has formalised the decision into institutional language, that contact must not occur. Population stable. There is a population, not a geological formation, not an electromagnetic phenomenon, not an acoustic anomaly, a population of something. Something that exists in sufficient numbers to have a population that can be assessed for stability, that can be described as not growing or shrinking in the way that populations grow or shrink. surface awareness unacceptable, the something, the population, can become aware of the surface. This is not a given. It is a condition that can occur and that the monitoring program is designed to prevent. The surface, meaning the human world, the populated world, the world above the mountains, is something that the population can become aware of in ways that are considered, by whoever is running this program, to be unacceptable. Remediation protocols to be maintained. When surface awareness does occur, there are protocols, actions taken to correct the situation. The word remediation, in a context like this, carries the weight of something done not just once, but repeatedly, as a standing procedure, applied whenever the condition it is designed to address arises. The government was not studying a geological anomaly. It was not monitoring an electromagnetic phenomenon. It was not managing a wildlife population in the conventional sense. It was managing a relationship between the surface world and something beneath it. A relationship that had been going on for long enough to require ongoing management, stable enough to be described in terms of consistent behavioural patterns, significant enough to have generated a classified monitoring directive in 1971 with roots in programs going back decades before that. The disappearances, the mining closures, the restricted areas, the monitoring stations, the Cold War bunkers built into pre-existing cavities, all of it organised over more than a century and a half around the management of a relationship that the public did not know existed. The government was not hiding monsters beneath the Appalachian Mountains. It was preventing interaction between two populations that had spent hundreds of millions of years evolving in separation, two populations that had now been pushed by the expansion of human civilization deeper into the mountain wilderness, into enough proximity that the old natural buffers were no longer adequate. It was acting, in the dry language of bureaucratic management, as a buffer. The national parks and national forests of the Appalachian region, managed, protected, kept as wilderness, kept free of the development that had consumed so much of the Eastern American landscape, were not solely what they appeared to be. They were a management strategy, a way of maintaining the separation that the monitoring program required, a way of keeping human populations dense enough to be monitored, but sparse enough in the deep wilderness not to trigger the response that deep wilderness entry provoked. The mountains were managed. The wilderness was managed. The disappearances, the ones that happened when management failed, when someone went deeper than they should have, when the buffer was breached, were managed as well, with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had been doing this for a very long time. The final night Calder returned to the hollow on a night in late November, 3 months after his first visit. He set up his equipment at the edge of the accessible terrain, within the range where his instruments functioned and outside the zone where the electromagnetic interference rendered them useless. He set up audio recording, thermal imaging, and a standard video camera that he left running continuously. He settled into wait. The forest was cold and absolutely still. The stars were clear above the ridgeline to the east, the sky that particular shade of deep blue that appears only at high elevation on windless winter nights. For 2 hours nothing happened, and then the forest went silent. Not quiet. It had been quiet throughout, the quietness of a remote mountain wilderness in the dead season. But at a specific moment, every sound that remained, the occasional crack of a branch cooling in the night air, the distant sound of a stream somewhere in the valley below, the barely perceptible rustle of leaves in a breeze he couldn't feel, stopped, all at once, as if someone had pressed a button. In the silence from the ridge below his position, a knocking sound. He had heard recordings of knocking sounds reported in these mountains. They appear in accounts going back decades, described consistently as wood striking wood, a sharp impact repeated in patterns that varied from location to location, but maintained an underlying structure that resisted classification as a random natural sound. He had always assumed, listening to the recordings, that he was hearing something he could find a conventional explanation for, something that could be attributed to a woodpecker's activity, to the thermal expansion of tree trunks in changing temperatures, to the acoustic trickery that mountain terrain sometimes played with distant mechanical sounds. Listening to the sound in person, in the total silence of a stopped forest, that confidence evaporated. It was a knock, a single knock, precise and deliberate, coming from somewhere below him in the dark, and then from a different direction, a direction that would have placed the source miles away from the first, separated by terrain that no person was moving through on that night. A response. The same pattern, echoed back with modifications that suggested not random acoustic reflection but intentional answer. Then, from a third location, farther still, the same pattern again, modified again, as if three sources separated by miles of mountain wilderness were conducting a conversation, as if information was passing between them through a medium that he was only hearing the surface expression of, the underground network translating vibration into sound at specific emergence points, carrying a signal across a distance that should have made communication impossible. He tracked the thermal camera toward the nearest emergence point. The sound was coming from a section of cliff face approximately 300 meters below his position, the rock dark in the absence of light, the camera's display showing the area in the false colours of thermal imaging. He almost missed it. At the edge of the cave opening that the thermal camera revealed, an opening he had not seen on his daytime visit, concealed by an overhang of rock that hid its existence from above, something emerged. Tall, very tall, taller than the cave mouth suggested should have been possible, moving with a smoothness that registered on the camera as a continuous fluid adjustment, rather than the distinct foot-by-foot movement of any animal locomotion he knew. Pale in the thermal display, not the bright orange-red of a warm-blooded mammal, but cooler, more muted, closer in temperature to its environment than any surface animal should have been. It stopped at the entrance to the cave. It stood there for a long time, long enough that Calder, watching the thermal display with a stillness born of something he did not want to identify as terror, had time to observe it in detail. It was not hunting. There was nothing in its posture, in the positioning of its body in relation to his own position, that read as the behaviour of a predator assessing prey. It was not displaying, the way an animal displays when it detects a perceived threat. It was not moving toward him or away from him. It was watching, standing at the mouth of its entrance into the surface world, far below him on the dark cliff face, aware of him with a precision that defied the darkness and the distance, aware of the equipment he was carrying, aware of what he had been doing in this place, aware, perhaps, of him specifically in a way that implied a knowledge of human individual identity that he was not prepared to consider, and watching, not with hostility, not with the aggressive readiness of something deciding whether to attack, with the patient, evaluating attention of something conducting an assessment, something that had encountered his presence in its territory and had decided, after whatever internal deliberation governed its responses, to come and look. Then it was gone, back through the cave mouth, into the mountain, in a movement so quick that the thermal camera barely caught the transition. The forest stayed silent for 3 minutes after it disappeared. Then, all at once, every sound returned. The branch crack, the distant water, the leaf rustle in the unfelt breeze, as if permission had been given, as if the assessment had concluded. Epilogue. The oldest mountains. Here is what we know. The Appalachian Mountains are 480 million years old. They are the oldest mountain range in North America, one of the oldest on Earth, survivors of geological catastrophes that reshaped the planet's entire surface while they endured. They contain, in their deep interior, a network of subsurface structures that multiple federal scientific agencies have documented, studied, and classified over more than 100 years of systematic investigation. Those structures are not natural formations. The geological record of the Appalachian region does not support their formation by any process that geologists understand. They were there before the mountains reached their maximum height. They may have been there before the mountains existed at all, in the period of ancient geological history when the terrain that would eventually produce the Appalachians was still the floor of a shallow inland sea. Something has been living in those structures for a very long time. Not monsters, not supernatural entities, not beings from another world or another dimension, or any of the other categories that popular culture has invented for things it cannot explain. Living organisms, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that have shaped every species on Earth, adapted to their specific environment with the thoroughness that hundreds of millions of years of natural selection can produce. Different from us in ways that are difficult to fully conceptualize, but operating under the same basic logic of survival that governs every living thing. Aware of the world above them in ways we don't fully understand, responsive to incursion into their territory in ways that the federal government has been quietly managing for more than a century. The national parks and national forests of the Appalachian region serve purposes that their official designations don't acknowledge. The missing persons whose disappearances cluster along the network's geography are paying a price that the managing institutions have apparently decided is acceptable and manageable. The sounds that residents of mountain communities have been reporting for generations, the electromagnetic anomalies that have been disrupting communications and navigation for as long as anyone has been measuring them, the wildlife managers who file reports in a category that should not exist. All of it connects to a reality that the relevant agencies understand and have chosen, for reasons they consider sufficient not to share. There is a line in the 1971 monitoring directive, a line that Calder has read so many times that it has become a permanent feature of how he understands both the document and the landscape it describes. Surface awareness unacceptable. They are aware of us. They have been aware of us for as long as humans have been in these mountains. They knew us before we knew them, in the way that something that can hear a footstep through 300 feet of rock knows the shape and rhythm and intention of what walks above it before that thing ever looks up and notices what is looking back. The monitoring continues. The buffer is maintained. The parks remain open for the hikers and the campers and the people who drive up the Skyline Drive on autumn weekends to look at the foliage. But somewhere below those parks, below the trails and the campgrounds and the scenic overlooks, in chambers that have existed since before complex life crawled out of the ocean, the network extends from Alabama to Pennsylvania, and something is listening. Something that has been listening since before we existed. Something that, 480 million years into a story that began before ours did, is still here, still listening, still watching, still waiting for us to understand that we are not the oldest thing in these mountains, we are simply the newest. And the mountains, patient, ancient, indifferent to the brief human drama playing out on their weathered surfaces, have been keeping that secret for longer than we have had language to ask the question. The boots are still beside the sleeping bag. The fire is still warm. The GPS tracker sent its last signal at 2:13 in the morning, 62% battery remaining, from coordinates that correspond almost exactly to a void in the official geographic record of that section of Pisgah National Forest. Daniel Mercer has not been found. He will not be found. And in the quiet hollows of the oldest mountains on Earth, in the darkness below the darkness we can see, something continues its patient, unbroken observation of the surface world above it, watching us the way we watch an anthill, with the particular detached interest of something vastly older, encountering something new, something loud and brief and blindly confident in its own centrality, something that has not yet understood that it arrived late to a world that was already, in every meaningful sense, occupied. The mountains have always known. They are 480 million years old. They have time. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you want, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The discovery began with something so small that most people would have dismissed it entirely. Noah Klein sat in his cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle, staring at a screen filled with error logs that nobody else wanted to review. His job title was Back-End Systems Auditor, which was a polite way of saying he spent 40 hours a week reading through the digital garbage that enterprise software produced when something went slightly wrong, but not wrong enough for anyone to care. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He was good at it because he had the kind of mind that found patterns in chaos, the kind of brain that could spot the single discordant note in an orchestra of data. Most people found his work unbearably tedious. Noah found it calming. Numbers didn't lie. Systems didn't have hidden agendas. Code did exactly what it was told, even when what it was told was stupid. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Noah was contracted to review archived error logs for a global cloud storage provider called Cirrus Systems. The company stored data for hospitals, banks, universities, telecommunications companies, and millions of individual users across 6 continents. Their infrastructure was enormous, redundant, and theoretically fail-safe, which meant, of course, that it failed constantly in small, invisible ways that Noah was paid to catalogue and explain. He had been scrolling through timestamp errors for the better part of an hour when he noticed something unusual. A cluster of identical errors, all occurring within the same 1-second window. That alone wasn't remarkable. Coordinated failures happened, but these errors weren't coordinated. They appeared across systems that had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Financial servers in London, weather satellites feeding data to stations in Tokyo, hospital databases in Mumbai, telecommunications networks in Sao Paulo, all recording the exact same microtiming drift at the exact same moment. Noah leaned closer to his screen. The timestamp drift was minuscule, measured in milliseconds, but it was identical across all systems, down to the 10th decimal place. These systems did not share clocks. They did not synchronize globally. They operated on entirely different networks, different continents, different security protocols. There was no technical reason they should experience the same timing error at the same instant. Noah opened a new terminal, window, and started pulling data. He expanded his search parameters, querying not just Cirrus Systems, but every client database he had access to through his contract clearances. The search took 11 minutes to compile results. When the data populated, Noah felt something shift in his chest. A small, cold weight settling into place. The anomaly wasn't limited to Cirrus Systems, it was everywhere. Across every major infrastructure network he could access, the same timestamp drift appeared. Power grids, air traffic control systems, stock exchanges, university research databases, government weather services. All of them showed the same error, the same correction, the same silent adjustment occurring within a single second on the same date. October the 3rd, 3:15 and 42 seconds in the afternoon, Pacific time. Noah checked the date. Today was October 17th. This had happened 2 weeks ago, and somehow no one had noticed. Or if they had noticed, no one had said anything. He spent the rest of the day pulling more data, cross-referencing systems, checking and rechecking his methodology. The scope of what he was seeing expanded with each query. Banking systems operated by SWIFT, the worldwide financial messaging network, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, known as CERN, with their precision timing systems for particle collision experiments, the International Space Station telemetry feeds, the Global Positioning System satellite network maintained by the United States Space Force, India's Regional Navigation Satellite System, China's Beidou constellation, Japan's Quasi-Zenith satellite system, all of them. every single one. The same microsecond-level timestamp drift, appearing like a fingerprint across systems that had no business sharing any commonality whatsoever. By the time the sun set over Puget Sound and the office lights automatically brightened to compensate, NOAA had confirmed the pattern across 47 independent systems in 19 countries. The error code, when it appeared at all, was always the same. R Sync Anomaly Autocorrect. Not a standard error designation, not something that appeared in any official documentation he could find. Identical timestamp drift, identical correction, all occurring in the same impossible moment. There was no blackout that day, no solar flare, no reported cyber attack, no equipment failure, no official incident report of any kind. He checked news archives, government databases, technical bulletins from every major infrastructure organisation. Nothing. October 3rd had been, by all official accounts, a completely ordinary day, just a subtle discrepancy in time, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. NOAA stayed late that night, alone in the office except for the cleaning crew that moved quietly through the halls with vacuum cleaners and trash bins. He built a visualization of the data, a timeline that showed the anomaly spreading across the globe in perfect synchronization. It looked like a wave, except waves had a source point. Waves propagated outward. This appeared everywhere at once, as if reality itself had stuttered, and then corrected itself before anyone could notice. He saved his work to an encrypted drive and went home to his apartment in Capitol Hill. He didn't sleep well. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from different angles, searching for the rational explanation that would make everything make sense again. The next morning, NOAA arrived at work early and immediately began searching for historical precedents. If this had happened once, it might have happened before. He wrote a script to scan archived logs going back 10 years, searching for similar patterns of synchronized anomalies. The script ran for 3 hours. When it finished, NOAA stared at the results with a growing sense of unease. There were earlier instances, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. 8 events over the past decade, each one showing the same signature of synchronized global corrections. May 17th of the previous year, March 9th 2 years before that, September 22nd 4 years back, November 3rd 6 years ago, February 11th 7 years prior, October 19th 8 years back, June 6th 9 years ago. And the earliest one he could find, January 29th, 10 years ago, almost to the day. Each time, the same signature appeared. Brief global anomalies, mass timing inconsistencies, unexplained synchronization errors that appeared across disconnected systems and then quietly corrected themselves. NOAA started pulling up news archives for each date. He wanted to know what else had happened on those days, whether there were any major events that might explain or coincide with the corrections. May 17th of the previous year, a major cryptocurrency exchange had experienced what they called a temporary desynchronization event that lasted 43 seconds. During that time, transactions were processed, but not recorded properly. The exchange blamed it on server maintenance and compensated affected users. No regulatory investigation was ever opened. But NOAA noticed something else. That was the same day that several major social media platforms reported unusual activity spikes, with millions of users posting and then deleting content within minutes, claiming they didn't remember writing the posts. March 9th 2 years before, nothing major in the news. But when NOAA dug deeper, he found scattered reports of GPS malfunctions affecting commercial aviation across the Pacific Rim. Planes hadn't crashed, but pilots reported their navigation system showing impossible positions for brief moments before correcting. The incidents were attributed to solar activity, despite the fact that there had been no significant solar events recorded that week. September 22nd, 4 years back. This one was more interesting. That was the day of what conspiracy theorists called the Reddit blackout mystery. For approximately 90 seconds, users across multiple continents reported seeing posts and threads that didn't belong in their timeline. Old posts appearing as new, deleted content briefly visible, comments responding to threads that didn't exist yet. The official explanation was a caching error during a database migration, but NOAA found something else. September 22nd was also the date that CERN had reported unexpected fluctuations in their atomic clock network. Not a malfunction, they insisted, just an interesting anomaly that occurred during a routine calibration. The fluctuations happened at exactly the same time as the Reddit incident. He kept digging through each date. The patterns emerged like hidden images in static. November the 3rd, 6 years ago, coincided with the infamous Mandela effect surge, where thousands of people simultaneously reported remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite him having lived until 2013. That same day, Wikipedia administrators noted an unprecedented number of users claiming that articles had been changed without edit history logs. The claims were dismissed as mass confusion, but the volume was statistically unusual. February 11th, 7 years prior, was the date of a global financial trading anomaly, where stock prices briefly showed values that would have required transactions that never occurred. Trading was halted for 17 minutes across Asian markets. Regulators blamed a software glitch in high-frequency trading algorithms, but no specific bug was ever identified or fixed. October 19th, 8 years back, was harder to trace, but NOAA eventually found references to it in obscure technical forums. Database administrators around the world reported that backup verification processes were failing because current data didn't match archived snapshots. Not corruption. The data was valid. It just didn't match records that had been created only days before. The explanations range from backup software bugs to administrator error, but the timing was global and simultaneous. Each time, nothing catastrophic happened. Official explanations, when they existed at all, were vague and technical. Atmospheric interference, quantum fluctuations in atomic clocks, software bugs in timing protocols. The data was quietly corrected and everyone moved on. But NOAA noticed something else. The dates weren't random. He created a spreadsheet tracking technological milestones. May 17th of the previous year was 3 months after the activation of the final nodes in the European Union's quantum encrypted financial network. March 9th, 2 years before, occurred 2 weeks after worldwide Internet of Things device connections exceeded 50 billion active units. September the 22nd, 4 years back, came immediately after a major expansion of global satellite networks, adding 3,700 new communication satellites to low Earth orbit. It was as if the anomalies occurred when the system became too complex, when too much data was being processed, when too many connections were being made, when the infrastructure of reality itself was being expanded beyond some invisible threshold, when there were too many observers. NOAA sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his keyboard. A thought was forming in his mind, a thought he didn't want to fully articulate even to himself. But it was there, persistent and growing. What if this wasn't a malfunction? What if it was maintenance? He spent the rest of the week digging deeper. He found references to the anomalies in obscure technical forums, buried in threads about timekeeping standards and network synchronization protocols. Most people dismissed them as statistical noise or measurement error. But a few voices stood out. Engineers who seemed to be speaking carefully, choosing their words with unusual precision. One post from a systems architect who worked on infrastructure for transcontinental data cables caught his attention. The post was 3 years old, discussing an unexplained synchronization event that had briefly disrupted financial trading systems across Asia and Europe. The username was Pacific Conduit, and they had a long posting history of thoughtful, measured technical analysis. The architect wrote, "We ran every diagnostic available, triple-checked our methodology, brought in external auditors. The timing error was real, measurable and consistent across all nodes spanning 14,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. But there was no source, no propagation delay, no evidence of any technical cause. It simply appeared everywhere simultaneously and then corrected itself within milliseconds. The official report attributed it to a calibration error in atomic clock networks, but I've worked with atomic clocks for 20 years. I've seen them fail in every possible way. They don't fail like this. They don't fail in perfect synchronization across geographically distributed systems with independent power sources and no common failure point. Someone on our team started calling it the patch. Not an outage, not a hack, a correction. Like when you update software and it fixes bugs you didn't know existed. Management told us to drop it and move on. We dropped it, but I didn't forget. Noah read the post 5 times. Then he started searching for the term, the patch. The results were scattered but consistent. Network engineers discussing unexplained corrections that happened too fast to be manual interventions. Database administrators noting silent data repairs with no recorded cause, no script execution logs, no administrator access records, no evidence of any process that could have made the changes. Security researchers puzzled by checksum validations that fix themselves, showing corrupted data one moment and perfect integrity the next with no intermediate state. One thread from a Linux kernel development forum caught his attention. A developer had noticed that certain system logs showed timestamp corrections that preceded the events they were supposedly correcting, as if the fix had been applied before the error occurred, or more accurately, as if the error and the fix had occurred simultaneously, but the logging system could only record them sequentially. It's like watching someone edit a document in real time, the developer wrote, except the cursor is moving backwards through text that's already been written. The changes appear, and then the history adjusts to accommodate them. I've seen this 3 times now, always during periods of high system load, always resolves itself, always leaves me feeling like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. Another thread, this one from a forum for satellite engineers, discussed anomalies in telemetry data during orbital maneuvers. The physics doesn't work backwards, someone had written. You can't have a course correction that precedes the detection of the deviation it's correcting. But that's what the logs show. Correction applied, then deviation detected, then position normalized. The timestamps are sequential. The causality is reversed. We reported it. Got a memo back saying our logging system had a known issue with timestamp sequencing during high priority operations. Thing is, I helped design that logging system. It doesn't have that issue. Always the same pattern. Something breaks in a way that shouldn't be possible. Then something fixes it in a way that shouldn't be possible, and everyone agrees to pretend it was normal. Noah tried to reach out to the systems architect who had written the original post about the patch, but the account had been deleted, not just inactive, completely removed from the forum's database. He found 2 other engineers who had mentioned similar events in detail, and sent them carefully worded messages asking for more information. Messages that didn't sound alarmist or conspiratorial, just professional curiosity about unusual edge cases in distributed systems. One never replied. The other sent back a single sentence. I don't work in that field anymore. Noah tried following up, asking what field they worked in now. The account was deactivated the next day. On Friday afternoon, Noah took a risk. He attended an infrastructure security conference being held at a hotel near the waterfront. He wasn't registered, but he bought a day pass at the door and spent hours moving between presentation rooms and networking sessions, listening to engineers discuss threat models and backup protocols and disaster recovery plans. During a coffee break, he approached an older man who had been introduced as having worked on satellite systems for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 30 years. Noah mentioned the timing anomalies casually, framing them as a curiosity he had noticed in some archived data. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition. A wariness. You noticed the corrections, the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. The what? That's what we called them, back when I was still active. The corrections. The man glanced around the room, then leaned slightly closer. You're not the first person to spot the pattern. You won't be the last. But you should know that asking questions about it openly is a good way to make your career complicated. Why? Noah asked. Because there's no good answer. No explanation that makes sense. So the people who control these systems decided the best approach was to not have the conversation at all. The man paused. I spent 2 years trying to understand what caused them. I built models, ran simulations, consulted with physicists. Nothing fit. Eventually I realised I had a choice. I could keep digging and become the crazy guy who sees patterns that aren't there. Or I could accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations and move on with my life. Which did you choose? Noah asked. The man smiled faintly. I'm retired now. I spend my time sailing and fixing old motorcycles. I sleep well at night. He set down his coffee cup. You seem like a smart person, so I'll give you the same advice someone gave me. Whatever you think you found, it's not worth the cost of pursuing it. Let it go. The man walked away before Noah could respond. That night Noah sat in his apartment with all his research spread across his desk and laptop screen. He had documentation of the anomalies. He had historical precedents. He had testimony from engineers who had seen the same things he was seeing. But he didn't have an explanation. And the more he looked at the data, the more one particular thought kept surfacing in his mind, unwanted and persistent. The anomalies looked exactly like what you would expect if reality were running on some kind of computational substrate. If the universe were information being processed rather than matter obeying physical laws. If existence itself were something that could be debugged, patched and optimized. It was an absurd thought. Noah knew that. He had never been interested in philosophy or metaphysics. He dealt with practical systems, concrete problems, measurable results. But the data didn't care what he believed. The data showed a pattern of synchronized corrections that had no technical explanation. The data showed reality behaving like a system under maintenance. Noah opened his laptop and started searching for scientific papers. Not conspiracy theories or fringe speculation. Real academic research. He found more than he expected. Digital physics. The hypothesis that the universe operates on discrete quantized units of information rather than continuous matter and energy. Papers from respected physicists at major universities, published in peer-reviewed journals. Information theory applied to cosmology. Research, suggesting that physical laws might be emergent properties of information processing. Studies on the limits of observable resolution in space-time. Simulation theory, not as science fiction, but as a serious philosophical argument developed by philosophers and computer scientists. The mathematical reasoning that suggested if it's possible to create simulated realities, and if simulated beings can create their own simulations, then the vast majority of conscious experiences must be occurring inside simulations rather than in base reality. Noah read until his eyes burned and his coffee went cold. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a framework. A way to make sense of what he was seeing without abandoning rationality entirely. And what he found was this. The universe behaves suspiciously like a rendered environment, optimized for observation, conserving computational resources. Quantum mechanics only resolves into definite states when measured. The speed of light acts like a frame rate limit. Planck length functions like pixel resolution. The universe appears to operate on the principle of minimum complexity, taking shortcuts wherever observation isn't occurring. It was all theoretical, interpretations of mathematics, philosophical arguments about the nature of existence. But it fit the data. If this were a simulation, the anomalies would make perfect sense. They would be exactly what maintenance would look like. Brief moments when the system became too complex, too unstable, requiring correction, patches applied to preserve stability, updates installed without warning. Noah closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment. The city lights of Seattle glowed through his window, thousands of lives proceeding normally, unaware of the pattern he'd uncovered. Or maybe aware and choosing not to care. He thought about the retired engineer's advice. Let it go. Move on. Accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations. It would be easy. He could delete his research, stop asking questions, focus on his work and his life and the things he could actually control. But he knew he wouldn't. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the glitch, Every moment of normalcy becomes suspicious. Every ordinary day becomes evidence of successful maintenance. The next week, Noah took a different approach. Instead of searching for answers, he searched for other people who were asking the same questions. He found them in unexpected places, not conspiracy forums or paranoid message boards, but in private technical mailing lists and closed professional groups. Engineers, physicists, infrastructure architects who had noticed anomalies and quietly documented them. They didn't debate whether reality glitched. They debated how much was altered each time it happened. Noah spent hours reading through archived conversations. The tone was never hysterical or dramatic. These were technical professionals discussing data, but beneath the measured language there was an undercurrent of deep unease. The mailing list was called Infrastructure Anomaly Research Group, abbreviated as IARG in the message headers. It appeared to have been active for at least 7 years, with sporadic bursts of activity that Noah quickly realised corresponded exactly with the correction events he had documented. One thread caught his attention. It was from 4 years ago, started by a network security researcher who had noticed unexplained changes in historical server logs. Not errors, changes. Data that had been recorded one way and then, after a correction event, was recorded differently. As if the past had been quietly edited. The initial post read, "I maintain rotating backups across 3 geographically distributed data centers with independent backup schedules. Standard practice for redundancy. During a routine verification check following the September 22nd event, I discovered discrepancies between backup sets that should be identical. Not corruption, the data integrity checks pass perfectly. The data is simply different. Transaction logs showing different timestamps for the same events, user activity records with different sequences, nothing critical enough to cause operational problems, but different nonetheless. I've cross-referenced against hard copy printouts from 2 weeks ago. The printouts don't match current digital records. Either my paper archives are wrong, or the data has been retroactively modified. Given that paper can't spontaneously change, I'm forced to consider the latter." The responses in the thread were measured but alarming. A database administrator from a major healthcare provider confirmed similar observations. Patient admission records showing different room assignments than what our nurses documented in physical logbooks. Times of medication administration off by minutes. Nothing clinically significant. No harm to patients. But the electronic records don't match the written documentation. We assumed data entry errors, but the volume is unusual, and it all appeared after the timing anomaly. A systems architect from a financial institution added, "We found transaction sequencing anomalies in our trade execution logs. Trades that our traders swear occurred in a different order than what the system shows. We have phone recordings of trade confirmations that reference transaction IDs that don't appear in our database in the sequence discussed. The transactions exist. The IDs are correct, but the temporal ordering is wrong. Compliance is treating it as a logging bug, but our logging system has been battle-tested for 15 years. Another message, from someone identifying themselves only as a university research administrator, was more direct. Our particle physics lab runs experiments with nanosecond precision. We maintain detailed lab notebooks, actual physical notebooks, alongside digital records. After each correction event, we've noticed small discrepancies, nothing that invalidates our research, but enough to be troubling. Detector readings that don't match handwritten notes, calibration values that differ from photographed whiteboard calculations. We started keeping sealed photographic archives as a control. The photographs don't change, the digital records do. We haven't published these findings because we have no framework to explain them. The thread continued for pages. Scientists discovering that old experimental data had slightly different values than they remembered recording. System architects finding configuration files that didn't match their implementation notes. Archivists noticing that database timestamps had been subtly adjusted across entire collections. All of it dismissed as human error. Memory mistakes, documentation failures, cognitive bias. But the timing always matched the correction events, and then about 40 messages into the thread, someone with the username architect773 posted something that seemed to stop the conversation cold. If this were a simulation, this is exactly how maintenance would look. Not catastrophic failures, not obvious glitches, just subtle corrections to preserve consistency. Think about how version control works in software development. When you update code, you don't just change the current version, you can rewrite the entire Git history if you need to. You can make it so a bug never existed in the first place. The system doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be coherent enough that observers don't notice the seams. And when consistency breaks down because too many events are occurring, too many observers are measuring things, too much complexity is emerging from the underlying rule set, the system performs maintenance. It patches itself. It retroactively edits causality to preserve coherence. Reality updated without warning. Version controlled like any other codebase. We're not experiencing glitches. We're experiencing optimization. The universe is being debugged around us, and we're part of the code being revised. The thread had no replies after that message. It was locked by a moderator with a note. Moving this discussion offline. Contact list admin if interested in continued technical consultation. Noah scrolled further through the archives. He found other threads with similar patterns. Technical discussions that started normally and then gradually escalated into uncomfortable territory. Questions about the nature of causality. Speculation about whether physical laws were descriptive or prescriptive. Debates about whether consciousness was a feature or a bug. And in every case, once the conversation reached a certain threshold of explicit speculation about the fundamental nature of reality, it was shut down or moved offline. He found one more exchange that chilled him. It was brief, just 2 messages. The first was from someone asking, "Has anyone else noticed that the corrections seem to be getting more frequent? 13 years ago, my records show one event every 18 to 24 months. Now we're seeing them every 4 to 6 months. What does it mean if the maintenance intervals are shortening?" The reply came from a username Noah didn't recognize. It means the system is becoming less stable. Complexity is increasing exponentially. Moore's law applied to reality itself. More observers, more measurements, more quantum states being resolved into definite values. The simulation, or whatever this is, has to work harder to maintain coherence. Think about running a game engine. The more objects you render, the more physics you simulate, the more processing power you need. Eventually you hit computational limits. You have to optimize, reduce polygon counts, simplify physics calculations, update the render distance. We might be experiencing the cosmic equivalent of a game engine struggling to maintain 60 frames per second. That thread had also been locked, but unlike the others, it had a different moderator note. This group is being reorganized. All members will receive individual contact from administration regarding continued participation. Noah tried to contact the list administrator. The email bounced back with a permanent failure message. The mailing list itself seemed to have been archived and made entirely private, inaccessible without credentials he didn't have. He searched for Architect 773 across different platforms. No results. The username appeared only in that single thread, in that single post, never again. But the ideas in that post wouldn't leave his mind. Version control applied to reality, the universe being debugged, maintenance intervals shortening as complexity increased. It explained everything. The timing anomalies, the retroactive edits, the fact that nothing catastrophic ever happened, because catastrophic failures were exactly what the patches were designed to prevent. It was the kind of explanation that seemed insane until you looked at the evidence, and then it seemed like the only explanation that fit. Noah understood why. What would happen if this information went mainstream? If everyone knew that reality occasionally glitched and corrected itself? That the past might be quietly edited? That existence itself appeared to be running on some kind of computational substrate? Chaos, panic, existential crisis on a global scale, or maybe nothing. Maybe people would shrug and go back to their lives because knowing the truth changed nothing about how they had to live. That was the real horror, Noah realized. Not the possibility that reality was a simulation, but the fact that it didn't matter. If awareness changes nothing, if rebellion is irrelevant, if escape is impossible, then what difference does discovery make? The simulation doesn't need belief, it only needs compliance. Noah kept digging anyway. He couldn't help himself. He expanded his search to look for physical evidence. If reality was being corrected, there should be residue, artifacts that survived the updates, inconsistencies that couldn't be edited away. He found more than he expected. People reported small, shared false memories. The Mandela effect, they called it. Thousands of people remembering the same details wrong. Logos that looked different than they remembered. Movie quotes that were never actually said. Geographic features in slightly different locations. Historical events with altered details. All dismissed as cognitive bias, faulty memory, social contamination of recollection. But Noah noticed the timing. Spikes in reports of the Mandela effect clustered around the correction events, as if the patches were imperfect, as if when reality was updated some observers retained memories of the previous version. He found references to sudden changes in digital archives, Wikipedia articles that people swore had contained different information, news reports that contradicted personal documentation, photographs that showed details no one remembered being there before. Again, all explained away. Edit histories mistaken. Personal records inaccurate, camera angles misremembered. But the pattern was there, persistent, undeniable if you were willing to look. Noah created a timeline, mapping correction events against spikes in reported anomalies. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to be significant. Strong enough to suggest that reality wasn't as stable as people assumed. He was still working on the timeline late one night when he found something that made his hands freeze over his keyboard. In one of the corrected datasets from the October event, buried deep in a metadata field that should have contained only system information, Noah found something impossible. A comment. A plain language annotation that read, "Stability preserved. Continue." Not code, not an error message, not diagnostic information. A note. Written as if by someone monitoring the process. Noah checked the metadata structure. He pulled up the database schema documentation, traced through the field definitions, verified the data types. There was no reason for a comment to be there. The field was defined as a binary timestamp with millisecond precision. It should contain exactly 8 bytes of temporal data, nothing more. No field in the database schema would accept plain text in that location. It shouldn't exist, but it did. He examined the raw hexadecimal data. The timestamp was there, perfectly valid, but appended to it, in clear ASCII text where nothing should be, were those 3 words. Noah's hands were shaking slightly as he began searching for similar annotations in other corrected datasets. He expanded his query parameters, searching not just the October event, but all the historical corrections he had documented. The search took 40 minutes to complete. He found 12 more annotations, each one embedded in impossible locations, each one written in plain language, each one suggesting oversight, monitoring management from somewhere outside the system itself. From the May event of the previous year, coherence restored, observer population stable, complexity within acceptable parameters. From the March event 2 years prior, update complete, no critical awareness detected, standard monitoring resumed. From the September event 4 years back, extensive revision required, multiple timeline branches collapsed, consensus reality maintained. That last one made Noah stop breathing for a moment. Multiple timeline branches collapsed, as if reality wasn't a single linear progression, but a tree of possibilities being constantly pruned. He kept reading. From the November event 6 years ago, memory revision partially successful, minor residual awareness acceptable, does not threaten coherence. From the February event 7 years back, causality loop resolved, retroactive continuity established, No observer impact detected. From one of the earlier events he had found, computational overhead reduced, observer resolution decreased in non-critical sectors, performance optimized. The annotations weren't consistent in style. Some were terse, almost like log entries. Others were more detailed, almost conversational. But they all shared certain characteristics. They all referenced observers. They all discussed coherence and stability. They all treated reality as something that could be managed, optimized, revised. Noah found one annotation that was different from the others, longer, more detailed. It appeared in a data set from an event 3 years ago that he had almost missed because it was so minor. Just a brief flicker of timing errors across a handful of systems. The annotation read, "Localized patch applied to Sector 7 Gamma 93. Quantum state resolution exceeding computational budget in high-density observer region. Implemented selective detail reduction. Decreased weather pattern complexity by 12%. Reduced background character behavioral diversity by 8%. Suspended non-observed astronomical event processing until observer attention redirected. Efficiency gained 37%. Note: observer identified as research installation continues investigation of correction events. Recommend enhanced monitoring but no direct intervention. Historical pattern suggests self-limiting awareness. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. Intervention would create unnecessary complexity and potential awareness cascade. Current strategy of plausible alternative explanation remains effective." Noah read that annotation 10 times. Each time, his sense of unreality deepened. Sector 7 Gamma 93, weather pattern complexity reduced, background character behavioral diversity, non-observed astronomical events suspended. The language was precise, technical, and utterly alien in its implications. It described reality as something being actively managed, optimized, edited in real time based on where observers were paying attention, and that final note about an observer, a research installation, continuing to investigate. Could that be referencing someone like him, or one of the scientists from the mailing list? Someone had noticed the patterns, and whoever wrote this annotation had decided not to intervene, because historical data suggested the awareness would be self-limiting. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. That phrase lodged itself in Noah's mind like a splinter. It suggested that this had happened before, that people had discovered the truth and then, what? Given up? Moved on? Accepted that knowing changed nothing? He found 2 more annotations that seemed to reference observer awareness directly. Note: increased correlation analysis activity detected among infrastructure monitoring personnel following last correction event. Pattern consistent with previous awareness spikes. Recommend no action. Self-terminating behaviour expected within standard time frame. And another: observer cluster in northwestern technology sector showing elevated pattern recognition activity. Probability of explicit simulation hypothesis formulation 63%. Risk assessment minimal. No historical precedent for awareness propagation beyond initial cluster. Containment through social mechanisms adequate. Containment through social mechanisms. Noah thought about the engineers who had stopped responding to his messages, the mailing list that had been shut down, the careers that had been redirected, not through force or intimidation, but through the simple social reality that you couldn't talk about this stuff without sounding crazy. The system didn't need to suppress the truth. It just needed to make the truth socially unacceptable to discuss seriously. He found one final annotation that seemed different from all the others. It wasn't attached to a correction event. It was embedded in a routine system backup from 6 months ago, in a data set that showed no anomalies at all, just normal, everyday data processing. But there, in a field that should have been empty, was a single line. The observers cannot see what they are not looking for. The system cannot fail in ways they can imagine. Truth is a function of perspective, and perspective is a privilege we grant selectively. They will continue. We will continue. Coherence will be maintained. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. These weren't just system logs. These were messages. Not for him, not for anyone in the simulation, but they existed within it, preserved in the data like fossils in sedimentary rock, proof that reality was being watched, managed, maintained by something that existed outside the framework of the existence he knew, and that something new people were noticing, knew and didn't care. Because knowing, in the end, changed nothing. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster than it should. He felt like he was looking at something he wasn't supposed to see, a note left behind by whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He thought about going public, releasing the data, showing people what he had found. But then he thought it through. What would happen? The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as corruption or injection from external tools. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove, and even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work, stop paying bills, stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. Not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing. Weeks passed. October became November. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. And then, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, Noah noticed another micro-correction beginning. He was at his desk monitoring the same systems he had been watching for weeks when the first timestamp drift appeared. It started in Hong Kong. Financial systems operated by the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited. The error appeared at exactly 9:47 and 16 seconds local time. Noah's monitoring software flagged it immediately. He pulled up the detailed logs. The drift was identical to the pattern he had seen before. Microsecond level desynchronization appearing across multiple independent systems simultaneously. Then weather satellites over the Pacific. The Himawari satellite network operated by the Japan Meteorological Agency showed the same timestamp anomaly, followed by telecommunications networks across Southeast Asia, then India, then the Middle East. The pattern was unmistakable. Another update was starting. Noah opened every monitoring tool he had. He had spent the past 3 weeks building a custom dashboard specifically for this moment. Real-time feeds from 43 different infrastructure networks across 6 continents. Automated alerts configured to detect the exact signature of a correction event. The alerts were firing in sequence, like a wave propagating around the planet. Europe. The European Organisation for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites showing anomalies. Banking systems operated by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication experiencing timing errors. Power grid management systems across the Nordic countries flagging synchronization warnings. North America, air traffic control systems, the Global Positioning Systems satellite network, hospital databases, university research networks, stock exchanges, all of them showing the same pattern within seconds of each other. Noah watched it happen live. He had imagined this moment would be dramatic, frightening, somehow apocalyptic, but it wasn't. It was quiet, clinical, just data flowing across his screens in patterns that shouldn't exist. He checked the error codes, all identical. Air sync, anomaly autocorrect. The same ghost code that appeared in every correction event, never defined in any official documentation. Everything continued normally. Through his office window, he could see the Seattle skyline proceeding with its usual Thursday morning rhythm. Delivery trucks making their rounds, construction workers on a building site 3 blocks away operating a crane, a flock of seagulls wheeling above the waterfront, their flight patterns governed by instinct and aerodynamics, and the simple physics of survival. People laughed in the hallway outside his office. Someone was talking about their plans for the weekend. A coffee machine beeped in the break room, the mundane sounds of ordinary existence unfolding exactly as it always did. Stock markets opened and processed millions of transactions. The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange rang at exactly 9:30 Eastern Time, triggering the beginning of another day of trading. Algorithms executed buy and sell orders based on mathematical models of value and risk, none of them aware that the infrastructure processing their transactions was experiencing a global timing anomaly. Airplanes took off and landed safely. Noah pulled up flight tracking data on one of his monitors. He could see thousands of aircraft in motion around the planet. Commercial flights, cargo planes, private jets, all of them navigating three-dimensional space with precision measured in meters and seconds. The correction event was passing through the systems that guided them. Not a single plane deviated from its flight path. Hospital equipment monitored patient vitals without error. He had access to status dashboards from 3 major healthcare systems through his contract work. Heart rate monitors, ventilators, diagnostic imaging systems, all of them continuing to function perfectly despite the timestamp anomalies flowing through their network infrastructure. Birds flew outside his window, following paths determined by instinct and physics. Noah watched them for a moment, these small lives completely unaware that the fabric of reality around them was being quietly adjusted. They banked and turned in formation, responding to environmental cues that were themselves being processed and rendered by whatever system maintained this existence. Reality did not break. It adjusted. Noah watched the correction propagate across his screens like a wave of silent maintenance, passing through the infrastructure of existence itself. He had configured his monitoring software to track not just the anomalies but the corrections, the moment when the timestamp errors were resolved, the instant when coherence was restored. The corrections followed the same geographic pattern as the anomalies, but in reverse, starting in North America and flowing back toward Asia, as if the system were validating the patches, confirming stability before moving on. He pulled up his annotation scanner, the tool he had built to search for those impossible plain text comments embedded in the corrected data. He had configured it to run automatically during any detected correction event, scraping through the updated datasets in real time looking for new messages. The scanner found something within minutes, a new annotation, longer than any he had seen before. Correction event 773 complete. Temporal coherence restored across all monitored sectors. Observer population 9.2 billion, increase of 1.7% since last correction. Quantum state resolutions per second 3.8 trillion, exceeding design parameters by 19%. Computational overhead increased by 22%. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. Recommendation: increase correction frequency or implement selective detail reduction protocols. Note: high complexity observer identified in northwestern sector continues pattern analysis of correction events. Awareness level elevated but remains within acceptable parameters. Individual demonstrates technical competence and pattern recognition, capabilities above baseline. Probability of actionable conclusion, minimal. Probability of awareness propagation, negligible. No intervention required. Observer will reach logical endpoint, acknowledgement of powerlessness, within standard time frame. Historical data suggests integration without disruption. Continue monitoring. Noah read the annotation 3 times, each word precisely chosen, each phrase carrying implications that expanded like fractals the more he thought about them. 9.2 billion observers, the global population counted and catalogued 3.8 trillion quantum state resolutions per second. Reality being calculated, rendered, maintained at a scale beyond human comprehension. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. The system was struggling. The maintenance intervals were shortening because the universe, or the simulation, or whatever this was becoming harder to sustain. And that note. High complexity observer in northwestern sector. That was him. Had to be him. Northwestern sector. Seattle was in the Pacific Northwest. An observer analysing correction events. They were talking about him specifically. Probability of actionable conclusion. Minimal. That phrase cut deeper than anything else. They knew he would figure it out. They expected people to figure it out. But they also knew it wouldn't matter. Because what was he going to do? What could anyone do? Observer will reach logical endpoint. Acknowledgement of powerlessness. Within standard time frame. He thought about the retired engineer who had warned him to let it go. The deleted accounts, the closed mailing lists, the careers redirected into safer territory. They had all reached the same logical endpoint. The moment when curiosity transformed into acceptance. When understanding became indistinguishable from surrender. Noah checked his other monitors. The correction was completing. The timestamp errors were resolving. The systems were stabilizing. In another few minutes, it would be over. Reality would have been successfully maintained for another cycle. He thought about going public. He had all the evidence, the annotations, the historical patterns, the correlation data. He could compile it into a report, post it online, send it to journalists and scientists and anyone who might listen. But he had already played out that scenario in his mind 100 times. He knew what would happen. The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as data corruption or injection from external tools or elaborate hoaxes. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove completely. And even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted by a few researchers or conspiracy theorists or curious engineers, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. People would still go to work, pay bills, fall in love, raise children, pursue careers, build lives. The day-to-day mechanics of existence would continue because there was no alternative. You couldn't opt out of reality just because you knew it was being actively maintained. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work? Stop paying bills? Stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. The correction completed. Noah watched the final system stabilize. The timestamp errors resolved. The anomalies corrected. The ghost error codes disappeared from the logs. Everything proceeded normally, as if nothing had happened. As if the fabric of reality hadn't just been debugged and optimized around 9 billion observers who remained completely unaware. Noah's phone buzzed. A text message from his manager. Team meeting at 2, conference room B. Don't forget the quarterly review slides. The ordinary demands of ordinary existence. Meetings, deadlines, performance reviews. The machinery of professional life continuing its endless rotation. He looked at his monitors one last time. The data was there. The evidence was preserved. The annotations existed in databases scattered across multiple secured systems. Future researchers, if they looked carefully enough, would find the same patterns he had found. They would ask the same questions, reach the same conclusions, and they would face the same choice. Acceptance or obsession, integration or isolation. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. It was just information. Just another pattern in the endless complexity of existence. When the correction finished, Noah checked the annotated data sets. There was a new comment, embedded in the same impossible location. Patch applied successfully. Observer population stable. Complexity within acceptable parameters. Continue standard operations. Noah saved the data to his encrypted drive. He would add it to his timeline. He would document the event. He would note the correlations and patterns, not because it would lead anywhere, not because it would change anything, but because it was true. And truth, even meaningless truth, deserved to be recorded. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. He built better tools, more sophisticated scanning algorithms, deeper analysis frameworks, not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing, even if the watchers were themselves being watched. Weeks passed. November became December. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft, wrapping everything in mist that made the buildings look like they were only partially rendered, their upper floors fading into low-resolution fog. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. He dated occasionally with limited success. He visited his parents for Thanksgiving and said nothing about what he'd discovered. He played pickup, basketball on Sunday mornings, and pretended to care about whether his team won or lost. The machinery of existence ground forward, indifferent to his knowledge of its inner workings. But he kept monitoring, and in the quiet hours of early morning, when the city slept and his apartment was silent except for the hum of his computer equipment, he would review the annotations he had collected, reading them like ancient texts, searching for meaning in the precise language of whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He found patterns in the annotations themselves. The style evolved over time. Early annotations were terse, almost mechanical. Recent ones were more elaborate, more conversational, as if the maintainers were becoming more confident or less concerned about being discovered. Or maybe, Noah thought, they wanted to be discovered. Maybe the annotations were intentional breadcrumbs, a test to see which observers would notice, a way to identify the high-complexity individuals who might pose problems or might be useful for some purpose he couldn't begin to imagine. He found one annotation from an older correction event that seemed to address this directly. Embedded reference markers continue to function as designed. Complexity-weighted observer selection proceeding as expected. High pattern recognition individuals will discover annotations and draw appropriate conclusions. This creates no operational problems and may serve useful function in future scenario branches. Awareness of maintenance is not equivalent to understanding of purpose. Observers can know they are observed without comprehending the observation framework. Continue strategic transparency protocol. Strategic transparency. They wanted some people to find out. The system was designed to allow discovery by certain types of minds while keeping the truth socially marginalized and individually powerless. It was elegant, in a horrifying way. You couldn't call it a conspiracy if the evidence was right there in the data for anyone who looked carefully enough. You couldn't claim suppression if nobody was actively stopping you from talking about it. The containment was built into human psychology itself. The social cost of sounding crazy, the professional risk of pursuing unprovable claims, the existential exhaustion of knowing something that changes nothing. On a Friday afternoon in early December, Noah received an email. No sender name, just an address composed of random characters at a domain he didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The email contained a single sentence. "You're not the only one watching. We meet Tuesdays. Seattle Public Library, 4th floor study room 7, 7 p.m. Come if you want. Don't if you don't. Either way, you've already made your choice." Noah stared at the email for a long time. He checked the headers, tried to trace the routing, ran every analysis tool he knew. The email was real, not spoofed, but the origin was obscured. Through enough layers that he would need forensic resources, he didn't have to track it back. A group, other people who had noticed, other high-complexity observers who had found the patterns and couldn't let them go. The email made no claims, offered no promises, just information and a choice. Noah thought about the retired engineer's warning, about the deleted accounts and closed mailing lists, about the annotation that described observers reaching logical endpoints and integrating without disruption. Was this part of the containment? A honeypot to identify and monitor the people who couldn't accept powerlessness? Or was it genuine? A community of the uncomfortably aware? The email was sent on Friday. Tuesday was 4 days away. Noah spent the weekend thinking about it. He went hiking in the Cascades on Saturday, pushing himself up muddy trails until his legs burned and his lungs ached. The physical exhaustion felt clean, uncomplicated. Trees grew according to simple rules. Water flowed downhill. Gravity operated consistently. Out here, away from networks and databases and infrastructure, the simulation felt less oppressive. Or maybe that was the point. Maybe the natural world was easier to render, computationally cheaper than the complexity of human civilization. On Sunday night, he made his decision. Tuesday evening, Noah walked into the Seattle Public Library at 6:55. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, found study room 7. The door was closed, no light visible through the frosted glass window. He stood outside for 2 minutes, hand on the door handle, weighing the choice one final time. Then he opened the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No people, no furniture except the standard library table and chairs, no note, no sign that anyone had been there or was planning to be there. Noah stood in the doorway feeling like an idiot. It had been a test or a joke, or maybe the email itself was just a glitch, a piece of spam that his pattern-seeking brain had turned into meaning. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the whiteboard mounted to the wall, a single line of text in black marker. If you're reading this, you already know. Knowing is a stuff. Going further only makes it harder. This is your last exit. Take it. Below that, in different handwriting. Or don't. Room 7, next Tuesday, same time, we'll be here. Noah read both messages 3 times. The first was a warning. The second was an invitation. 2 voices, 2 philosophies. Accept and move on, or commit and connect with others who couldn't let it go. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the whiteboard. Then he erased both messages carefully, leaving no trace. He left the library and walked home through the cold December night. His breath visible in the air, streetlights creating small pools of illumination against the darkness. The city was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed in years. The rain slicked, streets reflected coloured lights. Buildings stood like monuments to human persistence. People moved through their lives with purpose and dignity and hope, all of it potentially simulated, all of it possibly being debugged and optimized even as he observed it. And somehow, knowing that made it no less real, no less valuable, no less worthy of appreciation. The simulation, if that's what it was, contained real consciousness, real pain and real joy, real choices with real consequences. Whether the substrate was physical matter or information being processed somewhere beyond comprehension didn't change the lived experience. You were still responsible for your choices, still accountable for your actions, still capable of love and creation and meaning. The truth was both terrifying and liberating. Reality might be maintained by forces beyond your control, but your experience of it was still yours. The simulation might set the rules, but you still had to play the game. And playing well or poorly, kindly or cruelly, courageously or fearfully, those choices still mattered within the context you were given. Noah reached his apartment and climbed the stairs to his floor. He unlocked his door and went inside. His computer equipment was still running, monitors glowing in the darkness, data streaming across screens that nobody was watching. He sat down at his desk and checked his monitoring tools. The systems were stable, no anomalies, no corrections, just the normal operation of global infrastructure humming along invisibly, keeping civilization running. He opened a new document and started typing. Not a report, not an exposé, just a record. A detailed chronicle of everything he had discovered, written in precise technical language, documented with evidence and analysis and careful reasoning. He wrote for 3 hours, barely pausing. When he finished, he had a 20-page document that laid out the entire pattern, the timing anomalies, the historical precedents, the annotations, the implications. He saved it to multiple encrypted backups. Then he exported it as a PDF and attached it to an email draft. The recipient field was empty. He stared at it for a long moment, cursor blinking. He could send this to journalists, scientists, government agencies. He could release it publicly, post it on every platform available. Or he could delete it, walk away, accept the logical endpoint that had been predicted for him. Or he could do something else entirely. Save it. Keep it as insurance or evidence or simply as proof to himself that he hadn't imagined any of this. Archive it and move forward, carrying the knowledge quietly, watching and waiting for whatever came next. Noah made his choice. He deleted the email draft, kept the document, and opened his calendar next Tuesday evening. Room 7, same time. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some truths don't lead to liberation. Some knowledge only brings the burden of awareness without, the power of action. But at least you don't have to carry it alone. He closed his monitoring tools and returned to his assigned work. Error logs that needed reviewing. Reports that needed writing. The ordinary invisible labour of maintaining systems that most people never thought about. Outside his window, Seattle went about its day. Commuters drove to work. Students attended classes. Baristas made coffee. Children played in parks. The city hummed with the energy of millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any individual to comprehend. Reality, simulated or not, continued. And that, Noah understood, was the final truth. Simulations don't end when they're discovered. They end when they're no longer useful. Until then, they run. They update. They patch themselves when complexity threatens coherence. And the observers within them go on observing, living, dying, loving, struggling, never quite sure whether the ground beneath their feet is as solid as it seems, but walking forward anyway because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but continue. Noah turned back to his work. Somewhere in the logs he was reviewing there would be more anomalies, more patterns, more evidence of the invisible maintenance that kept existence coherent. He would find them. He would document them. He would watch the next update and the one after that. Not because it mattered in any cosmic sense, but because once you see the pattern, you can't look away, even when you know that looking changes nothing. The screen in front of him refreshed, loading new data. In the bottom corner, a system notification appeared briefly and then vanished. System status, normal, all processes operating within expected parameters. Noah smiled faintly and kept working. Outside his window, Seattle continued. Rain fell. Lights glowed. People lived and died and loved and struggled and created meaning in a universe that might or might not be as solid as it seemed. And somewhere beyond the observable framework of reality, the maintainers made a note in their logs. Observer 773 showing expected integration pattern. Awareness stable. Behaviour predictable. Continue standard monitoring. No intervention required. The patch had been applied. The system had adapted. Everything was proceeding as calculated. The simulation continued. The observers continued. The patches continued. And reality, carefully maintained and quietly corrected, proceeded exactly as designed. Somewhere beyond Noah's comprehension, beyond the scope of his monitoring tools and data sets, the system logged another successful update. Patch applied. Stability preserved. Continue.